Hello, my name is Giorgio, and I will be talking to you today about Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden was a former CIA systems administrator. He also worked previously as a systems engineer and administrator and a telecommunication system officer. Snowden comes from a government family. He was in the military, and his sister and mother were working for the government and still do. He joined shortly after 9/11 because he thought that the government did the right things for the right people, and he had a belief that the government was trying to do the right things for the right reason. Now, this isn't false, as there are people in the government who are doing things for the right reason or for what they believe is right. He brought to the light about government surveillance collecting intelligence by any means necessary. The government had believed that they were serving the national interest without consulting the democracy, and this became an issue. Before Snowden was a whistleblower, some of Congress was unaware of these intelligence programs. In the interview with Harvard, Snowden talks about how he actually tried to first take the issue internally, but the higher ups wouldn't do anything about it because to them it was just another normal day, so they wouldn't pay attention to any of that. And the problem is that the government's supposed to have a system of checks and balances where if some branch in the government has too much power, then there's another branch that can go ahead and check that. When Snowden first realized what was going on, he asked himself, is it possible to work for a branch of government and report it to another branch and have the issues fixed internally? And Snowden actually tried to do that. Edward Snowden had privileged access and could easily do harm and leak any information. He had the ability to look at anybody's emails, and he exposed a lot of information, and he saw a lot of things which made him feel as if though he was abusing power. And he noticed that other people in the institution didn't pay attention and ignored all these issues. And when he did his interview, he made sure that he only gave the press what they truly had public interest in, and made sure that they wouldn't publish any of the other documents that he had provided. The issue with the government monitoring everybody is that the government shouldn't be forced to comb through all of our information, and the NSA believes that they serve the national interest by doing this surveillance. The NSA targets everybody, and it analyzes and stores all the information because it's much easier and more convenient to gather information collectively. And with any issues that have been brought up, the government will never reduce its own surveillance, and this causes us to have even less privacy for ourselves. Senior officials in the intelligence community were less accountable to the public when it came to these kind of issues. Going back to the Harvard interview, Snowden gave a phone example saying that if you lost your phone and someone else found your phone, then it would have access to all your information and all your data. But if your phone was encrypted, then all the information would still be yours. All the information would still be safe, and we would still have control over our own privacy. And this is the kind of movement that Snowden hopes that we can take, being able to limit what the NSA can achieve by encrypting all the information and then giving the encryption power to other people. And one big issue with this is that if the government's hacking your computer, then they can steal the tools to encrypt all of your information, because apparently if the information is visible to you, then that means that it is already encrypted. And anybody who hacks your computer, not just the government, can actually access that kind of information, and nothing becomes private anymore unless it's already encrypted and you hide the tool somewhere else. Snowden views that the government failed on acting towards the expansion of surveillance due to being unaware or just not willing to, and that caused Snowden to stand up and say something to the public. Snowden never published anything, and instead let the press decide what to do with the information and what information to publish, and this would allow the public to go through the democratic process so that people could have a say in the outcome instead of it just being him, as Snowden believes that bringing issues to the public helps the quality of our government. There are several reasons why the public should decide on these privacy laws, and one of them is because a lot of the intelligence surveillance violates the Fourth Amendment, which is our property of our personal violation. It is unreasonable to search and unreasonable to seizure, and it also stops the police and government agents from searching us without probable cause, most of the time requiring them to receive a warrant from a court in order to do such seizures. The majority of the surveillance targets many innocent people, and the FBI can hack anybody. They can steal the key to encrypted data from anyone, and they can survey the entire population. Even if you aren't doing anything wrong, you are still being watched and recorded for what you potentially could be doing wrong. And if this doesn't make us feel uneasy about our government, then what will it take? They do a lot of pre-criminal investigation, which allows them to collect from individuals who have not even committed any crime yet. And the White House even argues against it, saying that it is not necessarily to have to go out and go collect everybody's data. One issue that Snowden brings up is that the investigation fails when the government is watching everybody. And one example he brought up was the Boston Marathon. The Russian intelligence actually gave a tip to the US about who the bombers were, and the government, being informed, knew ahead of time, but due to the overload of information, it just took away from monitoring the specific individual targets, and it didn't stop it in time. Looking at statistics released by the NSA in 2017 show that the government collected information from over 56,000 individuals, even though they had only 27 targets to surveillance. And looking at the same statistics released later on showed that they collected 534 million records of American phone calls with only 40 surveillance targets. This clearly brings up the issue of the NSA collecting much more than their actual intended targets, and there's no certain way to determine how many of these individuals are impacted through all of the collection. After the interview with The Guardian, a lot of people saw what Edward Snowden did or were informed, and then some people saw him as a spy, some people saw him as a hero, and then there's a bunch of issues with the government as well. The New York Times thinks that Snowden did not commit any crimes and that he actually did the country a great service, but an OPED from the New York Times believed that Snowden should have been prosecuted for what he took, for breaking the law, and if he felt the need to leak the information, then he should have done it legally instead of just kind of giving the documents to The Guardian, being like, hey, you guys decide what the public does. And according to an official NSA memo to Congress, Snowden persuaded some of his colleagues into giving him their logins and passwords, which ended up granting Snowden access to the documents that he used to leak. And many of his colleagues ended up being fired for being careless with their information. And while this isn't an act of espionage, Snowden did misguide his colleagues for his own gain, so he's not completely innocent either. Snowden had the ability to leak much more information than he did. He could even leak US intelligence operations, and he had access to all the reports right at his fingertips, so he could have done a lot of damage if he really wanted to. And the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, believes that Snowden did break the law and he had intention on harming the US government, and he thinks that Snowden should be punished for his actions. Looking at an interview with Rolling Stone, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates thinks that he doesn't view Snowden as a hero. He thinks that Snowden certainly broke the law, and if Snowden had gone about it in a more legal way and hadn't fled the country after leaking the documents or whistleblowing, then it might have been a different cause. He might have seen it as an okay action instead of seeing it the way he does. Jesselyn Raddick from the Government Accountability Project found Snowden's actions ethical for acting for the public good, and claiming that the law itself is already unjust and unconstitutional, and therefore Snowden was completely ethical about being responsible for the violations on his contract. The government charged Snowden with theft, unauthorized communication of national defense information. He was also charged of public disclosure for all the classified intelligence information that he leaked. Snowden does plan on coming back to the US eventually for a fair trial, but the issue is he points out that there's no due process for whistleblowing for private contractors because it doesn't happen, so they don't have that. And the only act that would follow would be the Espionage Act, but that's for spies, which he is not. A couple years back, former President Obama had pardoned Snowden, but the entire House of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence had sent Obama a letter on Snowden's whistleblowing helped inform the public of these surveillance issues, and in 2015, Congress passed the USA Freedoms Act to end the large-scale surveillance that the NSA currently has. Unfortunately, the bill has not been successful in limiting the NSA's reach, and currently the USA Freedom Act is pushing to have the NSA release full statistics on call record details of every time they do their collections. When the surveillance first started, the spying was very discriminate, and it was heavily biased on race, religion, or political views, and there hasn't really been any effectiveness of this collecting method that the NSA has been practicing. The public currently believes that the NSA should inform when they are going to end a program or when they intend to restart a program when they are going to collect information. And there are several petitions on edwardsnowden.com, such as the Stop Watching Us letter to Congress, which has more than 570,000 signatures demanding Congress to reveal the NSA's full spying programs, and another petition of the American Civil Liberties Union directed at former President Obama to grant Snowden immunity. Edward Snowden felt strongly about the wrongdoing that the government was funding and felt such an event shouldn't be solely up to the government to decide, and he did the nation a service by leaking the documents and exposing the National Security Agency. Now, the proper laws and actions can be taken to limit what the NSA should be allowed to have access to. To a degree, you have to understand that the surveillance is about our safety, but knowing that you can't make a phone call, send a text, send an email, share a picture without it being stored in government property is kind of a bummer, because it really does take away from our privacy. We never truly have 100% privacy. Everything's always going to be stored, recorded, collected, and there should be a limit on how much the government can do, like if they're doing keyword searches, so if they're looking specifically for certain things, because the issue that Snowden brings up is if they have all this information on me and then one day I commit a crime, then they can go back in time and look at every single person I've talked to and see if I'm linked to anybody else for that crime. And while this actually would work for the FBI for actual act of terrorism, it still affects a lot of people because it's 24/7 spying and it's completely unconstitutional. But with the government being so out of reach like that, people can only have so much say, and bringing up this issue really helps the public interest because we can collect together and then we can face the government and do our best to have laws made to limit how much the NSA can collect. It's not a battle of letting or not letting the NSA have access. It's limiting how much power they have, which is what checks and balances should already be doing. But because so much of Congress and the government was already unaware of the surveillance programs that were going on, they couldn't really take much actions, and this was the issue once Edward Snowden had brought it up to the other branches of the government, because they either didn't know about it or they just didn't want to do anything about it, and that was an issue, which is why Snowden had to go up and reach out to The Guardian and do the interview. That way he could bring this issue up, and then once the public was informed, they could group together and the committees could put together something for the government. And having all this evidence that the NSA was collecting all this data, they could now face the government with all their hard evidence and bring up issues, hoping that they could fix the government. Thanks for watching.
If I had just wanted to harm the U.S., that you could shut down the surveillance system in an afternoon. But that's not my intention. And I think for anyone making that argument, they need to think, if they were in my position, and you live a privileged life, you're living in Hawaii in paradise and making a ton of money, what would it take to make you leave everything behind? The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change. People will see in the media all of these disclosures. They'll know the lengths that the government is going to grant themselves powers unilaterally to create greater control over American society and global society. But they won't be willing to take the risks necessarily to stand up and fight to change things, to force their representatives to actually take a stand in their interests. And the months ahead, the years ahead, it's only going to get worse until eventually there will be a time where policies will change, because the only thing that restricts the activities of the surveillance state are policy. Even our agreements with other sovereign governments, we consider that to be a stipulation of policy rather than a stipulation of law. And because of that, a new leader will be elected. They'll flip the switch, say that because of the crisis, because of the dangers that we face in the world, you know, some new and unpredicted threat, we need more authority, we need more power, and there will be nothing the people can do at that point to oppose it, and it'll be turnkey tyranny.